Good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to be here and see you all, and thank you to the organisers for asking me to come along. My name is Hugh Leonard. I'm chair of the EHE Rare Cancer Charity. That's already been mentioned. In time-honoured tradition, I'll start by saying there are no conflicts. I also want to be clear, I'm going to talk about and make observations about ultra-rare diseases and how they struggle. It is not my intent to criticise any individual or group in this process. And if I do say anything that does or appears to do that, that was not my intent. Why did I describe this talk as critical but flawed? Critical, firstly, because ultra-rare disease patients have an utterly desperate unmet patient need. We often refer to this as an urgent unmet need. But urgent doesn't even get close to it. Urgent is something when your toilet is blocked. When you face a life-threatening condition and you have a disease that has no treatment, then it is utterly desperate, I can assure you. Flawed, simply because repurposing, I don't believe, for ultra-rare diseases is delivering at the moment. It's not delivering the advances they need. It's not doing it in the timescale required. And I think a lot of the barriers are probably the same barriers they faced 10 years ago and 20 years ago. So one of the messages today is we have to start doing things differently. A little bit about EHE as to why I can stand here and talk about ultra-rare diseases. EHE stands for epithelioid hemangioendothelioma. It is an ultra-rare sarcoma. It causes tumors in blood vessels. It affects less than one person in every million of the population. We estimate in Europe, including the UK, we would see about 180 to 200 patients a year. Because it is so rare, there's no cure and there is no approved treatment that works. A key target for clinicians, therefore, right at the moment, is to try and simply stabilize progressive disease, because in its progressive form, EHE is very destructive and always fatal. In terms of repurposing, the good news started in 2015 when Dr. Silvia Stacchiotti and her sarcoma team in Italy wondered if mTOR inhibitors might be effective for the disease and started to very gently test that with some patients. Results were almost immediately positive. Today, I'm glad to say we have 10 years and a significant body of evidence that suggests that a drug called sirolimus, but mTOR inhibitors in general, do stabilize the disease far more effectively than any other drug that's been tried before. In fact, the drug is now widely used off-label. It's prescribed in the UK, US, Australia, across the world. And you may therefore ask, well, why do we need an approval if it's being prescribed off-label everywhere? The challenge is that for a patient to access the drug off-label, they need four things. One, they need a doctor who will prescribe off-label. Two, the doctor needs to work in a hospital that will allow them to prescribe off-label. Three, they all need to be in a health system that allows off-label. And if all of those three work, then four, someone has to pay for the drug, either the national health system, the institute, or the insurer. And that often is not the case. So for a majority of EHE patients around the world, sirolimus is just not available to them, which is tragic because they will go through a whole series of drugs that are generally approved for soft tissue sarcomas, none of which will work, and ultimately probably die. A couple of quick observations. This one, I just wanted to do this. I've just plotted here disease frequency against complexity of a whole series of issues. And what we see here is that the rarer the disease, the more complex practically every issue is, from diagnosis to treatment plans to regulatory and the urgency of achieving an approval. If on that graph we also plot common practice or established practice from common diseases, you can see that that whole area lies in the bottom right-hand corner of that chart. The challenge, of course, for ultra-rare diseases is they're not there. They're in the top left-hand corner of that chart, and you see a large gap there, and we'll come back to that later. But what this tells us is that common practices and adherence to common practice across the board fails ultra-rare diseases. Hence, we get back to what I said earlier, we have to do things differently. On this graph, we just wanted to look, or graphic, we just wanted to look at the different ways drugs come forward for approval. And I've simplified this to novel compounds, which pharma typically generate, produce, and then there's repurposed drugs. Novel compounds don't actually apply to ultra-rare diseases because no pharma is going to develop an ultra-rare disease novel compound. It's just not going to happen. So for ultra-rare diseases, any advances in new drugs will almost certainly come through the repurposing process. And that will involve initially, at a high-risk stage, testing whether the drug could work, as Silva Stacchiotti did in 2015 with sirolimus. And if the results are positive, building up more and more information about that until we get to the left-hand bottom side of this graph, where there is actually a very significant database of information to support the drug being approved. And that's where most ultra-rare diseases will sit when they come forward for regulatory approval. Again, what patients understand is they completely understand the challenges of rare diseases, ultra-rare diseases. They live with them every day of their lives. What they don't understand is why it takes so long to make any progress. They have not got the time for us to talk endlessly about these diseases and understand the risks, but do nothing about it. So a key issue for us is delivery, and we'll talk about that later. Who are the key players in this process? There's 4 groups here. You know them all: patients and patient advocates for obvious reasons, academia and clinicians, because they are almost certainly going to be the starting point of the repurposing process. Regulators and legislators, of course, are going to be important because we'll need their approval. We have to get them involved far earlier. They have to be embedded in this process. It doesn't work when we do all the work and go to them absolutely cold at the end of the process and they're unsighted. So we have to change that. And of course, pharma. Pharma are really important, if for no other reason, because we will always need the marketing authorization holder to be part of the process. Even after Article 48 is approved, that's still going to be the case. Pharma don't like ultra-rare diseases, and we'll come on and talk about that a little bit and how we can help them. Let's talk about regulators. Regulators do a very tough job, and we all benefit if we all go to doctor and they prescribe a drug and we take it, and we never question whether we should take it. And we don't question it because the regulator has done their job and made sure it's safe. So I will never belittle what the regulators do. They have a lot of toolboxes that they've developed over a lot of time. The problem is that they predominantly work with common diseases. And in working with common diseases, what happens is you develop what I've called here the envelope of established practice in which they operate. And you can see it here, big red square. Okay, so for ultra-rare diseases, the challenge is that their solution space is right up there in the top left-hand corner where we saw it before. Actually, it could be over there, but I'll put it up there. And you can see the gap again. So once again, we have to do something about that. And I don't believe that regulators can discount retrospective data. They can't discount real-world data. Sorry, couldn't remember the thing. I think the processes tend to be very rigorous. They tend to be written answers and questions because that's how they maintain their distance. As I said, we need to get them into the body of this work, embedded into the team. How do we deal with this problem? How we don't deal with it is just nudging that envelope just a little bit towards ultra-rare diseases. That won't work. There are probably 2 solutions, I think. One is they have to genuinely pull ultra-rare diseases inside that envelope. The other possibility is they don't do that, but they set up a dedicated rare disease team that deals with that issue. In reality, what works best probably is that they do both of those. They pull it into the envelope of practice, but actually have a dedicated team who will just think ultra-rare disease because it needs a completely different way of thinking. Another thing I wanted to just mention was with ultra-rare diseases is sort of who makes the decisions. On this table, I've listed down the left-hand side all the main, not a complete list, but most of the main treatment options for a patient with EHE, including off-label prescription at the bottom in red. All of those decisions will be made by doctors and MDT teams. And those doctors and MDTs every time, hopefully with the patient, will make a benefit risk analysis when they decide which treatment they give. That's what they're required to do by our health systems. That's what they're paid to do. And that's what they want to do. That's their job. They carry the liability for that. Strangely, however, when we get to drug approval, we suddenly take all of that approval process. And remember, those are the doctors who understand the disease. They're the experts. They understand it. They work with it every day. And we put it into a group of regulators who don't work with the disease very much. Now, that might work for common diseases where there's huge amounts of data, etc. But for ultra rare diseases, that is a real problem. And one of the things that I would like to see happen, I hope will happen, is that the clinician's voice carries far more weight with regulators than I think it does at the current time. Let's move on to pharma. This is a graphic that I took out of the, graphic I took out of the internet. These are the 10 largest pharmaceutical companies, and this is the forecast revenue for them for 2024, which is just short of $500 billion. Looking at prior years, I think that translates into an income of about $100 billion. If we asked all of those 10, just for argument's sake, to donate $1 million each to an ultra rare disease fund that would help with finding new treatments, that $10 million would represent 0.01% of their income. And that's without any tax write-off. The reality is they would be able to write that off again, or certainly partially against tax, so it wouldn't even be that big. And we need to remember that that $500 billion of revenue is accessed through the regulatory process. So diseases and patient communities and regulators should have some clout here. But it's not just about revenues. It's not that easy. The reality is that pharmaceutical companies are major commercial organizations. They're very, very good at what they do. And regardless of whether it's the oil business or pharmaceuticals or anything, these organizations, before they invest money, will require a deep understanding of the risk and costs associated with what they're getting into. They want clarity on timing, procurement, procedures, responsibilities, access, deliverables, and outcomes. And they are non-negotiable. We can sit here all day long moaning about that, but they are non-negotiable. So we have to accept that and think about how do we make it easier for them? Because that's what we want. We want them to engage. The first thing I would suggest, I think this morning there was a couple of talks about combining regulatory processes across countries. For ultra rare diseases, we need all the big regulators to come together, I believe, and say for an ultra rare disease, you go through one approval process and it will actually be accepted by all these regulatory bodies. That fundamentally changes the risk and cost equation for pharmaceutical companies, because as soon as they get that one approval, they have marketing in the US, in Canada, in Europe, in the UK, in Australia. So they open up a huge number of markets all in one step. The alternative is they go through the drug approval process in every single one of those jurisdictions. And that's not going to happen for an ultra rare disease. We could say, and I think regulators should say, that accessing their processes for ultra rare diseases is zero cost, not waived, not funded in the future, zero cost. It won't happen very often, sadly, for ultra rare diseases. It's not going to be a big part of the thing. And actually, if that makes regulators feel queasy, then bump up all your other applications by 1 or 2%. You'll more than cover that cost. But what it'll do is bring ultra rare disease pharmaceutical companies hopefully to the table. We also have to look at sort of practices like, I believe there's some jurisdictions, if you get a label extension, then the price of the drug for all uses in that jurisdiction goes down because you've got a label extension. That is the death knell for ultra rare diseases, because the revenue stream from that small, tiny addition will be massively outweighed by that reduction in pricing. So basically, stop doing it. If you do it, don't do that. Don't change the pricing. We can also introduce some behavioral incentives. We can, for example, we could say to pharmaceutical companies, okay, you have to put in $1 million to ultra rare disease work over the year. That could be providing drugs for trials or studies. It could be actually providing funding for trials. It could be building a collaboration with an ultra rare disease group or something like that. It's up to them to a degree to how they do that. And then at the end of the year, if they haven't done it, then there has to be some sort of penalty. It could be that all costs for everything else they want to do go up by 5%. So there's a financial penalty. You could even limit their access for a while to the regulatory bodies. These are all things you could do, but I'm hoping that if we can deal with some of those earlier things I described about costs, we don't have to do those. Third group, academia, clinicians. You are the heroes of this story. These are the guys that spend every day of their working life with patients trying to help them survive ultra rare diseases. They work tirelessly to find solutions and put into place infrastructure to help. Dr. Stacchiotti recently, 2 years ago, launched the PUSH platform to try and bring together international sarcoma units around the world to collate information about these rare diseases. So that's fantastic. There is a slight problem, though, with academia. That is that typically, if pharma come to them and access data from trials or studies, then that company has to pay the full cost that went into collecting that data. So that, again, just instantly kills the idea. They're not going to do that. So don't do that. Let the pharmaceutical companies have free access to the data. And if you want to get some form of return, then do that post approval of a drug. So the pharmaceutical company knows it's going to have to contribute something, but not until after a drug is approved. And if the approval doesn't happen, then they don't pay anything. And that could be I've got 1 minute. That could be a lump sum, or even better, a small percentage like a royalty of the drug that's been approved. So that would be good. Patient advocates, we do a good job, I think. We drive hard, we raise funds. Our biggest problem is we all want to be nice and warm and cuddly, and we don't like upsetting people. But history tells us that change only happens when we do upset people, or not upset, but when we apply pressure. And so we've got to be better than that. We've got to be the groups that drive this process and demand change. So from an ultra rare disease perspective, we need to do things differently. You know, the 3 words I came up with were coordination, collaboration, and delivery. If we can't cure cancer by talking about it, if we could have done that, we'd have done it years ago. Talk about it, that's really important. But at every end of every conversation, let's define objectives, let's set timescales, let's assign responsible people to deliver that. What might the model look like for this? This is my delivery of task forces. I wasn't sure what the collective noun for task forces was. I thought delivery was quite good. It's the same group, but wouldn't it be great for ultra rare diseases if each of those 4 groups put together a very small little task force, and all those 4 task forces came together and really considered how they, and by working together, how they can take ultra rare drug disease forward. And so I can't say we've always got to define deliverables if I don't define a deliverable. So my deliverable from IDR 25 is, let's define people from those four key groups, a date when they're going to meet, and a time at which and what their objectives will be. And maybe we could develop a drug approval charter for ultra rare diseases and start the process of change. I think we owe that to ultra rare patients. They deserve our help. A lot of them think they're forgotten. Some of them think they're not even thought about. That's not true. And I think we need to prove that to them and show that I think they deserve that. Thank you.